Minister, we're running out of time to stop a climate crisis becoming a catastrophe. Every day, every equivocation, every cowardly U-turn makes that work so much harder. We know people in Ireland are especially worried about the impact of climate change. We only need to look at the recent flooding events in Middleton to get a glimpse of what the future holds. According to new research from the EPA today, 3/4 of people believe that extreme weather poses a risk to their communities. So much of our population live by the coast or by rivers. They see that rising sea levels and flooding poses risks to their home, their farm, their futures. That's why a large majority of people, 79%, say climate should be a high priority for government. Minister, this government claims that climate is a high priority, but what we see time and time again is that your climate rhetoric far exceeds climate action. Government MEPs voted for the nature restoration law in the EU this week, but simultaneously, we have 2 separate reports in the past week alone that confirm the government is nowhere near meeting its targets. The European Commission says Ireland will only reach 1/4 of the emissions cut that we need. And the Climate Change Advisory Council states that the government is nowhere near meeting the targets you set out for your first carbon budget. And Minister, when we inevitably miss those legally binding targets in 2030, the country faces the prospect of up to €8 billion in fines from the EU. Imagine what €8 billion could do to improve our biodiversity. Imagine what €8 billion could do to expand public transport systems across the country. Imagine what €8 billion could do to protect the future of Irish agriculture. We're so far behind where we need to be now that making up ground will be extremely difficult. But at the pace this government is moving, it will be impossible. Minister, climate action requires more than plans laid out in glossy brochures and watered-down legislation. It requires actually implementing measures that are going to make a real difference, and it means doing so quickly. We can't wait until next month or next year to start this work. We need climate action yesterday. Instead, this government is knowingly setting us up for failure. Minister, we all know that doing nothing is not an option, but equally, not doing enough isn't an option either. Can you outline what changes the government will make to avoid this impending disaster and meet our climate targets?
Thank you, Deputy Cairns. Minister.
Dr. Cairns, and thank you very much for raising this important issue. And may I begin by paying tribute to my colleague, Minister of State Malcolm Noonan, for the leadership he's shown within government throughout this process. And I think that does deserve indeed to be commended. I think yesterday was a very significant day. You quite rightly acknowledged that government MEPs voted in favour of the nature restoration law. I'm sure you did note that the main opposition's MEP voted against. That's, I think, of particular importance to the Social Democrats, considering you're keeping your mind open after the election. And I'm sure this is something you'll want to discuss with Sinn Féin as to why they wish to remain climate laggards at a time when the rest of us are trying to pull together and taking decisions that are hard political decisions, particularly in an era of misinformation and disinformation about what this nature restoration law does and what it doesn't do. And I do think it was disappointing yesterday that some Irish MEPs voted against this, though very pleased that the overwhelming majority voted in favour. Now that the current text has been adopted by the Parliament without amendment, not a small task with 329 MEPs in favour, we'll now move forward to the Member State approval process. That's expected to take place currently on the 25th of March, where the Member States, including our own government, obviously on behalf of Ireland, will have a chance to formally adopt this as law. And my understanding is the compromise text is currently going through the various legal processes as well. The text, I think, does see the retention of flexibility gained in general approach, including an alignment of the marine targets with the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and a move from absolute area targets to increasing trend-based targets for urban ecosystems. I do think there's a lot of misinformation around the nature restoration law. I think there's a lot of fear-mongering. I think there's a lot of people attempting to use it to worry the agricultural community in a way that is inappropriate, because what will now happen is each state will now have to come up with its own national plan as to how it intends to act on the nature restoration law. We will have time to do that. We will each have to develop a national restoration plan, show how we intend to implement that plan, show how we intend to monitor and report against implementation. And let's also be clear, it is going to require government providing funding mechanisms to help people transition. And that is why in the last budget we made a specific decision to set aside some of our economic surplus, some of our financial surplus, into a specific fund for climate. And I think that's going to really be required now as we begin to develop the financial schemes that are going to be needed to help people transition. I'm very proud of the record of this government when it comes to climate, because I think we have taken a number of very important decisions. We've seen a 135% increase in funding for wildlife and parklands. We've seen our new national biodiversity plan. We have seen a huge increase in the number of homes now being retrofitted, in the number of people now seeking to drive electric vehicles. But there is no denying science in relation to this, and I do think there's some worrying commentary today, and I heard the director of, or part of the director of the EPA on RT Radio this morning about the number of people who still seek to equivocate around climate. There is a climate emergency. It is real. The science is real in relation to this. What we don't need to do in this house, and you're not doing it, but we don't need to lecture to farmers and others about you must do this and you must do that. We need to help people transition. The government's put a number of measures in place already to do this. The government will put more, and yesterday's adoption of the nature restoration law was a very, very significant step for Ireland, for the bulk of our MEPs, and I believe for the European Union.
Cairns.
Minister, you either, I suppose, didn't hear my contribution or questions, or you just didn't have a defence for our own climate targets, which is what I'm asking about. Obviously, I welcomed the government MEPs voting for the nature restoration law, but I didn't ask you about that, and that's all you kind of replied about. The reality is that independent expert groups believe that we're on course to massively miss our climate targets. So if you can accept that, if you can't accept that reality, it's quite worrying. There's no denying the science, and continuing with an incomplete and inadequate climate action plan guarantees failure. Expecting the nature restoration law to change that course is guaranteed failure. If we don't act now, it will devastate the country, and the people who will feel the impact first will be our farmers, our rural communities, and people living in poverty. Minister, can you tell me what all of the experts who say we'll miss our targets are missing if you don't agree? You didn't reference our targets, because when last year's offshore wind project in the country, when the last one is 20 years old, when the government promised a low-interest loan scheme for retrofitting would be placed by 2020, but nearly 2 years later we still don't have it, when 85% of our protected habitats are in poor condition, with 46% in active decline, the list goes on. Minister, do you accept the reality that the government is not going to meet your climate targets? You don't accept the science?
Thank you, Deputy. The time is up. Thank you.
And what are you going to do about it?
Minister.
Just because someone doesn't agree with you doesn't mean they don't accept science. I'm actually a minister for science, just for the record. So I very much accept the science, and we very much accept the advisory structures we set up, and we very much accept that the challenges and targets that have been set are really difficult, and it very much accepts that every day, every week, every month it requires government doing new things. But if you take agriculture, for example, as an area that has significant focus on... No, I accept where government is... Yeah, it'd be lovely to answer it. The government is absolutely bound by the targets and is working to achieve the targets. Do I accept the targets are extraordinarily challenging? I do. But I'm pointing out that in sectors where in this House it has been said, farming, for example, will never reach its targets, that's now not true. We're actually seeing emissions from farming and agriculture drop. We're seeing farmers do their bit and make the difference. We're seeing investment in technology through Science Foundation Ireland, for example, to help farms now, indeed I think in your own part of the world, in West Cork, become carbon neutral in terms of how they deliver. We're seeing a real increase now in the investment that we're making in the retrofitting of our homes to get 500,000 done by 2030, which is a core part of our plan. We're seeing incentives to help people convert to electric vehicles. We are making the investments, and we will make more, because I do agree with you, the climate emergency is real, the science is clear, and meeting our targets is absolutely required, and we will continue to work across parties to make that happen.
Now on behalf of the Regional Group, Deputy